of the reasons you would create co-management boards and consultative boards and advisory boards and whatnot is that whatever decision you come up with, you can then say, people had a fair shake at that input. It reflects some of the compromises and trade-offs have already been made. I don't have to make them. So I don't know the numbers on that, but I think in most cases, the easier call for the minister is to go with the recommendation of some kind of co-management board or advisory group and not to overrule it, because once you start overruling it, you've got to have a reason and an explanation. And you might have to explain that in court to somebody, like, why didn't you go with the process that the law provided for? So I know it happens, but all of the incentives are kind of to go with the co-management groups.
G'day, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Co-Management Commons podcast. Today, we have a very special guest with us, Michael Wernick, a man who has dedicated his life to public service and has held some of the most senior roles in the Canadian government, including the prestigious position of Clerk of the Privy Council. And Michael has had an illustrious career in public service, spanning over 3 decades. He has been at the heart of Canadian governance, contributing significantly to public policy and reforms. His insights and experiences have shaped the landscape of the public service management in Canada. And currently, Michael is now in a new role with an endowed research chair in public sector management at the University of Ottawa. And it's no surprise that he would be focusing on practical solutions to improve public sector management in Canada. He's also a great author. I really enjoyed his book titled Governing Canada, A Guide to the Tradecraft of Politics. And this book offers an insider's view on the workings of the Canadian government and serves as a valuable resource for aspiring politicians and policymakers. And in today's episode, we'll be diving into his journey into public service and his perspectives, and particularly we'll focus on Indigenous co-management given the context of this podcast. And we'll explore his time as the Deputy Minister for the Department of Indigenous Affairs and Northern Development, and the impact that treaties have on co-management in our country. So I hope you enjoy. Please sit back, relax, or enjoy your walk if you happen to be out on a nice walk during this podcast. And I think you'll find Michael's insights very interesting. So enjoy. I always ask people a bit about their positionality, where you're from, and sort of significant influences in your life that you would have brought to your work in the public service, for example.
Sure. Well, thanks for the invitation. I'd have to say I'm from Ottawa now. I've lived 43 of my 66 years in Ottawa, so this very much feels like home base. It's where we raised a family, and I'm still here after having left the federal public service. But I grew up in Ontario, in Northern Ontario, and then in Burlington, just west of Toronto. So I was always interested in politics as a teenager, and then I got into economics and political science at university, and anyway, ended up in a long career in the federal civil service. I always thought it was kind of one of those odd things that I ended up spending a lot of my career on Indigenous issues one way or another, certainly at the department, what then known as Indian Affairs, but in other jobs as well. For a lad from Sault Ste. Marie in Burlington, I think I'm very typical of my generation. I was a child in Sault Ste. Marie and grew up, had a happy childhood there, completely oblivious to the fact that there was a residential school, on the outskirts of town, only closed in 1970. And then in Burlington, all the place names were kind of derived from Mohawk origins. Joseph Brant is a big figure there. There's a Brant Street, Brant Hospital. I played soccer at Iroquois Park. My sister went to Tecumseh Public School, but these were just names, and we really didn't understand the significance of that history. I think it's the other way around. I think working on Indigenous issues as much as I had has been a shaping influence on my life rather than the other way around. I've learned so much.
Well, that in itself is a great way to frame that. And obviously, you were the deputy minister of the department for 8 years. And I'd really love to speak to you about that and your reflections during that time. And correct me if I'm wrong, there were many land claim agreements as well that were settled during that time. But maybe just leave it at that and be really interested to get your perspectives now on the role as the deputy minister. If you had any intersections with co-management boards and stuff, and or anecdotes from that time would be certainly insightful to this audience as well.
Sure. I had worked on Indigenous issues in the job before that, a Privy Council office. The Martin government had an extensive process that led to the Kelowna Accord, and the secretariat that ran that process reported to me at Privy Council office. And so I was moved to and made the deputy minister at the department very early in 2006. The Harper government was only a few months old. And I stayed for 8 years, which is a long time by modern deputy minister standards. And I'm certainly not the record holder at that department. Some of my mutton chop Victorian predecessors stayed for much longer and show up in the history books for all kinds of reasons. So it was 8 years, all the Harper government, four ministers, Jim Prentice, Chuck Strahl, John Duncan, and Bernard Brocourt. And I left, in the summer of 2014. So it had its highs and lows, both on the Indigenous and the Northern side. The first week I was on the job, Caledonia was a burning crisis, literally, in southern Ontario. We worked through the sort of political shocks of, the government deciding not to pursue the Kelowna Accord. We did the implementation of the residential schools agreement largely while I was there. Peak of the relationship was kind of the Crown First Nations gathering, an event which people tend to forget about in 2011 or 2012. And then it sort of changed with the Idle No More, and there was a deterioration of the relationship. And the collapse of the education reform in 2014 is basically when I said, I can't do anymore and it's time for somebody else to take the baton. So I left in the summer of 2014. There's always a lot going on in a department that's the focal point for Indigenous issues and Northern issues, and those are kind of overlapping categories. So there's lots of legislation, litigation, and treaty making and treaty implementation and so on. So I certainly, to get to your question, I came across issues around co-management and co-development during the time I was there. I think the Nunavut land claims agreement was an issue that we tried to make progress on resolution of implementation issues. From an earlier generation, we did reach a settlement with the James Bay Cree about implementation of the first modern treaty, the James Bay Agreement, and so on. So anyway, there's many episodes and stories from different parts of the broader relationship. And then I moved on and eventually became the cabinet secretary and the head of the public service during the Trudeau government. And one of the things that they did, which I'm sure you want to come to, is they rearranged the sort of federal machinery, as we call it, and changed the sort of fence post between the different departments in the summer of 2017. So the job that I used to have is now basically split and recombined into two different jobs now. So
Yeah, and what was the main rationale and thinking behind that split? That would be interesting, I think, for because a lot of us that are involved in co-management, we sometimes there are the indigenous peoples that have a treaty in place, and then there's others that don't have a treaty but still have rights. I'm curious to know more about the rationale for the split in the department.
yeah, the proponent of the push for it came from the Assembly of First Nations. It's something that they had wanted for quite some time, and the Trudeau government decided to go for it. There's always been a focal point in the federal government on Indigenous issues. I mean, certainly back to the 1870s, some minister has been responsible for Indian affairs and the Northern Territories and that's evolved over decades and generations. The same department basically ran the Northern Territories that weren't the original provinces. This is the space that was acquired from the Hudson Bay Company and eventually became Manitoba and Saskatchewan and Alberta, three federal territories still up in the north. So the Northern Affairs part of the department, really was literally a colonial kind of, running the government in those parts of the country, which were not provinces. But that overlapped with the Indigenous relationships. So to go back to your question, there was always a view that you were asking one minister to do an awful lot to stay on top of all the sort of current programs and services delivered to Indigenous communities, and whether they were on reserve or in treaty arrangements or in urban settings. And doing that, plus trying to build new relationships by negotiating and reaching new treaties or new self-government arrangements or dealing with historic issues and treaty implementation and litigation was just too much for one minister. So they basically decided we'll have one minister really focus on the services and programs, which is plenty to do, and another who would focus on basically what they call Crown Indigenous relations, which is really sort of treaty making and treaty implementation kinds of issues. And that's been the arrangement now for, I guess, going on about 7 years. And a lot of it has to do with just sheer scope and workload. Like you would burn out a single minister and a single deputy if you tried to do all of it under one hat. And that's not even counting a lot of the northern and Arctic and circumpolar stuff.
I got two questions that kind of relate to both sides of each new department now. And one
Mm,
of the things that I'm really curious about is land claim negotiations
mm.
themselves. And they're obviously known to take several decades. But during your time as the deputy, there were quite a few that came to conclusion during your term. And I'm really interested in any insights you'd have on what the real impetus is that ultimately gets these across the finish line. I tend to sometimes think it's because of economic development gives it that extra boost, but I'd be curious about your insights in that.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think there are a lot of factors, and you've touched on a few of them. I think what I would stress is that really the pace is set by the Indigenous partner and the Indigenous community, their aspirations and their internal politics and their decision making. There are communities that decide they want a sort of full-blown modern treaty, which involves not just sort of land and resources issues, but forms of self-government and creating institutions of government and health and education and so on. Other communities make other choices. They decide to pursue, what's often called sectoral self-government. Let's build a health authority or a child welfare authority, or we'll focus on land and their tools to get out of the Indian Act and take greater control over things like land use and land planning. So about 200 communities at the last time I checked have gone into the, First Nations Land Management Act, which basically gives them a lot of control over local land use and planning, and that can be very important to the community. Others decide to go into sort of regional and tribal council arrangements, pool the resources of smaller communities into larger entities and create something like the British Columbia, health authority. So, and in many cases, especially in British Columbia, where you have all this uncertainty about what Aboriginal and treaty rights mean, because you don't have the historic treaties, it's often in some nations decide the treaty process is for them and they negotiate and that kind of modern treaty. And others, have chosen that the treaty process is not for them. And so they stay out of it or they pursue litigation or other things. All that to say is that there are a lot of different relationships across the country. And you need a kind of an alignment where both sides are highly motivated to settle, largely to bring some certainty to issues around land use, hunting and fishing rights, resource extraction, and so on. And economic development is often the sort of underlying motive. Treaty making is a way for Indigenous communities and entities to have a say in decision making about development and to reap some of the benefits from it. So modern treaties made the Inuit of Nunavut the largest landowners in Canada, and they're sitting on a lot of critical minerals, which looks pretty good right now. For others, the important issue will be fisheries. For others, it'll be forestry and logging. For others, it'll be just having control, so that the land and resources are preserved for future generations. But that's a long way of saying you often need local leadership that's highly motivated to reach an agreement. That was certainly the case with the four that we did in my time. We actually reached the fifth with Claytley Tene in the Prince Rupert area, and it was defeated, or the Prince George area, sorry. And we actually did a fifth in the Prince George area with Claytley Tene, but it was defeated in a referendum in the community, so the treaty didn't proceed. So, but other communities, it was about implementation issues and old litigation or specific claims, which violations of the rights of communities by taking land away improperly and so on. So,
Yeah, that's a great explanation, and certainly gives me many different dimensions to think about than just the economic motivations. You're right, there's so many different varieties of relationships and histories. And I guess the second part of my question that I think is related to maybe the second department now is when we're in a situation where there is a treaty in place and a land claim has to
mhm,
be implemented. I'm curious to know at that stage, does the Department of, well, INAC at the time, have much
mhm.
influence in wrangling the other departments, like, say, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, when it comes to implementing the treaty? Or if you're on the ground as a practitioner, are your efforts better spent at that stage than going to each of the line departments?
Yeah, that's a great question. In fact, there's a few things we can unpack there. What I would say is you use the right word. It's influence. It's not power. One department can't order another to do something. One minister can't order another to do something. The basic software on which the Canadian government is organized, and most provincial governments as well, is that all of the entities that are part of the executive branch of government report to the legislature through ministers. And on the federal system, there are about 300 distinct sort of departments, agencies, tribunals, and so on. They're all accounted for. They're all assigned to a minister. And every minister has a sort of what we call in Ottawa portfolio of organizations that they're answerable to Parliament for. And that's the core of our system, is being answerable to Parliament, who write the laws and allocate all the funding and approve all the taxes. So it's a parliamentary system. So the Minister of Indigenous Issues, in this case, I think we're talking Crown Indigenous Relations, they have their own sort of accountabilities to Parliament, but they only really have influence on, say, the Minister of Transport, the Minister of Environment, Minister of Fisheries, and so on. Don't get me wrong, they will have obligations under the treaties. There may be fishing rights, there may be harvesting rights, there may be any number of things, but there isn't really an easy way to get those other departments to pay attention, because the difference is if you're in the Indigenous Affairs Department, it's all you do. You come in every day and 100% of your time and energy is on the Indigenous relationships. If you're at Fisheries and Oceans, it's one of the things that you do. So you're competing more for attention than anything. So there's a lot of mechanisms that try to compete for attention and focus and get people to pay attention. And I'm sure your listeners are familiar with a lot of them. I mean, the first thing is just keeping track of all the agreements and obligations. There are literally dozens of treaties. There's the pre-Confederation treaties. There are the famous historic numbered treaties across the West. There are modern land claims and self-government agreements. Some are very detailed, some are specific. So the department's always tried to keep a treaty rights information system to just keep track of all that and be able to know where we are on different things from the Crown's point of view. And then there, when I was there, we certainly started, and I'm sure that continues, an effort to provide sort of training and education and awareness so that people who work at fisheries or transport or finance or whatnot understand treaties, treaty relationships, have awareness, cultural training, all sorts of things. So there is quite a system of sort of that. And then it's a matter of creating the right tables and and getting people around to talk about implementation issues, have meetings with groups like the Land Claims Alliance, meet with the specific community or rights holding organization about what's going on. Sometimes groups have pursued litigation as a way of pursuing enforcement. So you end up with a lot of lawyers in the room from the Department of Justice advising on the risks of taking it to court and so on. And I would say fisheries is a sort of one example, but because lands and resources basically controlled by provincial governments, south of 60, as we say, then treaty implementation can often bring in the provincial government's role or territorial government's role in the north. And sometimes you have to get them to the table and get them to pay attention. There has been, as I'm sure your listeners are aware, an effort to create bodies like treaty commissions. Manitoba, Saskatchewan have had them for many years. Ontario's had a kind of stop-start experience with treaty commissions. British Columbia's had a very formal one that since the days of Brian Mulroney was a sort of a guardian of the treaty process and so on. And they are deliberately there to create some pressure for focus and attention on the treaty relationships. They've had a mixed success. I think some people would say they've had a net positive effect. Certainly in the last few years, there's been a lot of focus on the relationship, overall with Indigenous peoples, and reconciliation has been a big theme. But I think other people are of the view that these commissions really haven't had enough clout or influence to force departments and agencies and provincial governments to pay attention to treaty obligations.
Your emphasis on influence is really insightful. And I do want to say, by the way, that I really enjoyed your book, Governing Canada, A Guide to the Trade Craft of Politics. And in particular, I liked the style in which the book was written. Like it was very practical, and I really appreciate it. I think I mentioned that as a lead into this question because I'm in a setting of being a co-management practitioner. I'm an executive director for two boards. We go through a lot of process and we make recommendations for this thought exercise, the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans. And in the Fisheries Act, there tends to be a lot of influence on the fact that the minister has the ultimate authority or power, and that sometimes gets leaned on a lot. And I'm just wondering, with the different levels of bureaucracy, what advice you would give to a co-management board in the sense that there's so many human dimensions. Like, is time better spent working with the bureaucracy at a regional level or at the ADM and DM levels? Or should the boards be really concentrating on the ministers themselves and trying to get that face-to-face time with a minister? Just with your unique insights into all of that, I don't know if there's some sage advice you could give that would increase the
Yeah.
likelihood of advice getting accepted.
Well, I think my advice is not going to be totally helpful because I think it's all of the above, or to use the movie title, Everything Everywhere All at Once. You need to pursue all of the relationships. And I know that's easier said than done because you only have so much time and energy and ability to kind of meet with people. It's worth trying to figure out who does have the ultimate decision-making power when the issue that you're concerned about. You're quite right. Parliament set it up that the Minister of Fisheries has a lot of final, decision-making power in a number of areas. It would be slightly different for the Minister of Transport or the Minister of Agriculture in terms of final authority. What governments have done, and provincial governments do this too, is that they try to create a bit of a buffer between the politician minister and decision making on sort of allocations and regulations where there are going to be winners and losers. Because otherwise, everybody would just try to lobby the minister directly, and they just can't. It's smart for a minister to be able to say, we have a process, it's fair, it's open, it's inclusive, especially on things where there are economic winners and losers. So when you think about it, like broadcast licenses are decided by the CRTC, broadcast regulator. Copyright issues, which are pure winner-loser kinds of rulings, there's a copyright tribunal. A lot of energy issues go to whatever we used to call the National Energy Board, now the National Energy Regulator. There's a competition tribunal. Provincial governments have bodies that arbitrate appeals about zoning regulation, zoning decisions, and stuff like that. There's a municipal board in most provinces. I could go on and on. The point is that gives some protection to the minister to say, there's a fair process, it has rules and some transparency and an explainable process. And it's not just because you were a friend of a minister or gave money to the party during the last election. So it's cleansed Canada of a lot of sort of corruption and nepotism and things, and created. Now, the price of that is a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of process to go through. But ministers, they can ask questions and they can nudge people, why is this happening? And why haven't we met all of our obligations? Or why am I hearing about this? And they have a lot of sources. They certainly will hear from their departments and their officials, but and it's always worth talking to the department in question. But they're very sensitive to members of parliament, part of their political team. And I often encourage Indigenous communities and groups, don't just focus on the minister, like talk to every MP or senator from your area. They have an ability to access the minister and say, I've got this community in my area and they seem to be unhappy. Could you look into it? Or whatever it is, invite every MP within 100 kilometers to come visit, come and see what you're doing, come and meet with people, build relationships. It's always about human relationships. And I would say when you're dealing with a big department like Fisheries and Oceans or Indigenous Services, start at the local and regional level because you're going to have more of their time, more of their attention. They're going to get to know you better. If you end up at the deputy minister's table, as well-meaning as they may be, they're juggling dozens, if not hundreds of different relationships. 600 First Nations and 80 tribal councils and 50 political entities and probably about 100 different treaty relationships and so on. So they can only ever give a sliver of attention to any one thing. It's always multitasking. And the first question they'll do is they'll ask their regional office for some kind of background briefing, right? So you can't skip building good relationships when you can with the sort of local and regional offices and then work your way up. But it's never a waste of time to talk to a minister and I think rather than sort of, get on a plane and come to Ottawa, get them to come to your community when you're not asking for something. Come to this, the summer celebrations, come and visit the school, come and have a sit down with the council, that kind of thing. It's like all sort of human affairs, you have to build healthy relationships. And sometimes it doesn't work and you've got to be more assertive, or you may have to pursue legal action and to get their attention. But so it's a bit of all of the above is the long answer to your question. But if you can grab a minister, especially when they're out of Ottawa, they'll remember that they remember the visits and they remember the conversations, and they'll turn around on the trip back to their political staff or their department and say, I want to know more about this. Can you look into it?
Yeah, a lot of people in my particular region in Labrador certainly talk fondly of a time when Minister LeBlanc was the fisheries minister. And
Mhm.
I think he might have been the only fisheries minister that has ever gone to the north coast of Labrador and met the
Mhm.
communities. And ultimately, it led to the allocation of shrimp resources there, basically saved any remnants of a fishery there ever since. It's been so
Mhm.
impactful. So that though you definitely delivered a lot of really great advice through that, and appreciate the answer. And there's a lot of good
Yeah, I mean,
nuggets there.
most ministers are pretty smart about not getting overcommitted. That if they say yes or promise something, they want to know that they can follow through. I think typically what you'll get is if you get a meeting or visit with ministers' political staff is that they will be very friendly and encouraging and send a lot of positive signals, but they probably are not going to make commitments on the spot. But what they'll do is they'll go back and they'll get briefed up and they'll learn more and they'll try to figure out, how far can I go? Can I say yes here? What can I do about it? And sometimes they'll find if you say yes to this group, you're going to be, dealing with allocation issues that affect another group, and they're not, so uh, sometimes it's not easy to, for the minister to sort out all of the competing demands, especially in issues around allocation, because you are going to create winners and losers, and somebody's gain is somebody's economic loss.
Yeah, definitely. One part that you mentioned that I'm really curious to pick up on is that degree of separation and how effective it's been. And like you said, there's been bureaucracy created, and the co-management system itself in our country is an added level to the bureaucracy for sure. So I'm kind of curious. Sometimes I put myself in the shoes of the minister and wonder why they don't necessarily implement the advice of a co-management board and rely on that as a way of relieving some political pressure to point and say, well, it went through a co-management process that was negotiated in a treaty, and I'm implementing that. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but to me, it seems to align nicely with what you said. It would take that pressure off in some of those situations where, unfortunately, there is some reconciliation that needs to happen, and then that changes who the winners and losers are. Right.
Yeah, I agree with the premise of your question, one of the reasons you would create co-management boards and consultative boards and advisory boards and whatnot is that whatever decision you come up with, you can then say, people had a fair shake at input. It reflects some of the compromises and trade-offs have already been made. I don't have to make them. So I don't know the numbers on that, but I think in most cases, the easier call for the minister is to go with the recommendation of some kind of co-management board or advisory group and not to overrule it, because once you start overruling it, you've got to have a reason and an explanation. And you might have to explain that in court to somebody, like, why didn't you go with the process that the law provided for? So I know it happens, but all of the incentives are kind of to go with the co-management groups. I don't know enough about the specifics that you're referring to. There may be a slightly larger frame of dealing with commercial on sport fisheries or tourism interests or international discussions with in the fisheries environment that may have some bearing on the minister's thinking about it. But a lot of decisions involve kind of location decisions. Where are we going to build the corridor for this gas pipeline or this highway, or siting of a mine, siting of a wind farm or a solar institute, and so on. And those are always hotly contested. There's nothing gets people more riled up than land use issues. And so I think there's been a tendency to want those decisions to be heard at a very local level and to have the compromises and trade-offs identified well in advance. Otherwise, people are just going to go straight to the minister and try to lobby them. And, that's not a transparent and fair system.
Yeah, and I know in the academic world, there's quite a lot of debate about is co-management effective or not, and some people are
Mhm.
obviously arguing strongly for more of a co-governance system. Do you
Mhm.
see that happening in the future where there may be more devolution to governance versus a co-management sort of recommendation sort of scenario? Do you see that unfolding in the
Yeah.
future or?
I think the trend line would certainly suggest there'll be more of those kinds of formalized bodies for some kind of formal input in decision making and or some actual sort of co-decision making, or coming up with recommendations that then the minister has to sign off. But as we were talking about earlier, I think that's certainly the trend line. The things to keep in mind is that is at the end of the day, it's unlikely the minister can completely give away their accountability to Parliament, and they have to take a wider lens of whatever else is relevant. There might be international obligations. There may be neighboring groups and interests, and so on. Defining the right geography. This is a board with jurisdiction over what area, and you'll immediately end up with sort of, fence post and boundary issues. To give you an example, one way of thinking about fish allocation on the Fraser River in British Columbia is you can build treaties as you work your way up the river, but it really is one ecosystem, right? And so I think there are in excess of 40 First Nations along the river from the headwater to the estuary. So can you build a sort of consultative and allocation body that will capture 42 First Nations and all the non-Indigenous communities up and down the river? That's a big undertaking. Whereas if it's co-management of the lands inside a national park, you can literally draw a line around it, and the impact on the neighbors is fairly limited. So you can give it a lot of autonomy. So that's a long way of saying I think you're always going to end up cutting the cloth a little bit to local conditions and local geography. Co-management of a mine is a much easier thing to design than co-managing of a fisheries ecosystem.
Yeah, the animals definitely don't pay attention to all the boundaries that we've
Uh,
put in place, unfortunately. But maybe to switch gears a little bit, one of the things in our field that we talk a lot about is science, and a lot
mm,
of discussion about bridging science and indigenous knowledge systems, and certainly science in the Western sense is more predominant when it comes to managing fish and wildlife and so on. And curious too about your experiences interacting with the scientific advisory bodies. And do you think we can get to a place where indigenous knowledge systems are given like an equal weight or could be equally as influential when it comes to providing advice to departments. There's a lot to unpack there, but curious, because for me, when I reflect on when the Trudeau government first came into power, there was certainly a big emphasis was put on everything was going to be done based on science and evidence. And then for those of us that were working in the Indigenous space, that then begged the question, well, is Indigenous knowledge going to be an Indigenous science going to be considered as such? And in some ways, things got harder, and there seemed to be a bit of a tension between the government's importance of the relationship with Indigenous peoples, but also the importance of wanting to make decisions based on science. So there's a lot to unpack there, but really curious to get your insights onto that because it's probably the most well documented thing in academia when we talk about co-management is whose knowledge wins, right? Whose knowledge is most influential. And there seems to be that ongoing struggle that there are improvements in it, but it's still a lot of work to go.
No, it's a really good question, and I don't have any sort of direct experience the last 5 years, and I left INAC 10 years ago, so I'm drawing on sort of a little bit of observation. I think the trend line is that there's a greater role for Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous science to complement and to input and to be part of the input to decision making. I'm not sure that we'll ever get to a point where it's exclusively relied on for decisions, but it would be an important part of the inputs that go into it. And the reason for that probably has to do with most allocative and regulatory decisions end up being contested. Because there are winners and losers, the losers often will appeal, they'll seek recourse, they'll go to the court. They will, and Indigenous peoples have used that tool very well over the years to challenge development decisions and permitting and so on. So, and then the Crown then has to defend its decision making that the process was reasonable and that that it did rely on best available evidence at the time. It wasn't just arbitrary. We didn't just make this up. Here's the science we relied on. And the science evolves. It gets, we can do things with drones and tracking of, whale populations that nobody could have even conceived of doing 30 years ago. There's ability to sort of gather data in new ways. So like the science is always evolving. And best of my knowledge, best of my experience, I mean, Indigenous knowledge is not sort of single dogma, this is the truth. It's also conversation and dialogue, and it evolves over time. But the local knowledge is going to be very valuable to the inputs on environmental impacts, what's happening to the fisheries, what's happening to the forests, what's happening to especially in a time where climate change is accelerating, it's extremely valuable. Whether it will ever be relied on entirely, I think is going to depend on what you're talking about. If you're talking about routing decisions on a pipeline corridor, it's pretty specific. It's about what are the conditions in this valley that we want to put the pipeline through. Whereas large fisheries ecosystem, there'll be all kinds of input that you would want to have. But the minister ultimately is going to want to be able to say, I relied on evidence and my process was fair, or the courts will strike down the decision and you have to go back to square one and start all over again. So I think that explains a lot of it. I think we've seen in a lot of areas an openness to rely on elders and Indigenous science, and environmental monitoring has grown over the last 10 years. There are various forms of guardians programs and Coast Guard auxiliaries and that sort of thing where Indigenous communities can participate and contribute a lot to the gathering of data and evidence for decision making.
Yeah, one of the things that I'm interested to hear your thoughts on too now that you're in a new position with the University of Ottawa and having had so much influence over the years within government, like what's that perspective like for you now to be shaping the conversation outside the walls of government? Has it, because I find the stuff that you're sharing on LinkedIn and other platforms, it definitely generates discussion, very thought provoking, and it's a different form of influence. So Just curious how you're finding that and your approach to being effective now in the academic and public space.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I mean, there are many ways to contribute to public life in Canada. You can go into electoral politics and run for office and at various levels of government or in communities. You can become part of the sort of public service that supports those governments at every level of government. You can work in academia and think tanks, generating ideas and proposals and trying to nourish, what we these days we would call a supply chain of ideas for the government's politics to work on. Or you can become an advocate, join one of the many groups that sort of advocates for particular positions or issues or groups. All of those are important. They're all part of being an open democratic society. I loved being a senior public servant because I had proximity. I talked to ministers. I had one-on-one conversations with ministers and prime ministers. It's better to be in the room than not be in the room if what you're looking for is sort of, having a little bit of an ability to nudge a conversation or raise an issue or, say, well, have you thought about this or, and so on. And I treasure those memories, but, those days are that chapter is over. So now when you leave government and you've still got some gas in the tank, to use an old metaphor, then I decided to spend some time more on generating ideas and proposals and asking questions which are uncomfortable. If you're the deputy minister and you go to a conference and you raise some controversial idea, you're immediately going to create some controversy and some backlash, and people will run to the minister and say, So I think you have more freedom, less constraints when you work in the university and academic environment, and so I spend my time writing and sort of working in that space. But, make no mistake, you don't have that kind of access. I used to talk to the prime minister several times a week. I haven't talked to him for years now. So, and there's a whole organizations and lobbyists and people, government relations consultants and people trying to figure out how to influence that small group of women and men that we elect and put into positions of power. So, there are days I miss it, but then when I remember just how busy and multitasking it was, this is, we're talking during an extremely busy week with all kinds of announcements and policy, statements, and we're coming up to a federal budget, and there's a lot going on, and so I think sometimes it's nice to have a bit more time to read and think and reflect and breathe and focus on one thing. What I say in the book is, what governing feels like when you're close to the center of it is you're just constantly juggling and multitasking. You have too many things to read, too many people to see, too many places to go, not enough time. You always wish you had more information and more time, and you just got to do the best you can. And it's an important skill for ministers and public servants to learn. But you don't get a lot of soak time and a lot of reflection and a lot of chance to recharge your batteries.
Well, there's no doubt. I think taking on the position that you're in now is definitely a public service to Canada to be able to share those insights and be freer to generate those discussions. Not everybody does that necessarily when they transition into a new career. So I look forward to following along with many of your talks that I know you have planned. And I don't know if, with the time that we have left for our conversation this morning, if there was any sort of broad sweeping advice that you would give to people in the co-management space or trying to influence ministers, I guess, from adjacent, we'll say. We're certainly not in there with a prime minister or a minister very often.
I recognize that it can often feel like a slog, and I often admired the sort of just sheer persistence and relentlessness of a lot of the Indigenous partners that we were dealing with, working your way through processes and getting attention and competing for finite resources and so on. And it can often feel, I think, very frustrating. I just encourage people to carry on and be persistent and be brave and be very direct. And sometimes the winds change and things open up and you get a responsive minister or the economic opportunity comes along. And a lot of it is about being ready to step through that door when it opens. So it's important work. Sometimes you have to look back 5 or 10 or 20 years to see the tracks in the snow and see how far we've come. And I often get caught between acknowledging all the work that still has to be done on reconciliation, but also looking back and saying, geez, look how far we've come in the last 30 or 40 years. And I do that because I think it should give us some hope and energy and motivation that if the generations of leaders before us accomplished so much, we owe it to them to carry on the struggle.
That's a nice way, I think, to end our conversation on because there is hope. And I know as I've been talking to many people now through this podcast, it's become very evident that Canada itself also has a very enviable co-management system in place. Other countries around the world certainly aren't doing this level of consultation and treaties in place and so on. And I guess it's sometimes we lose sight of, like you said, how far we have come and how good things are. And that doesn't negate the fact that it's also true that we have a lot more hard work to do. So I think that's a good way to end our time together this morning, unless you have any sort of final parting thoughts or advice on our whole conversation in its entirety.
No, I really appreciate the interest and sort of, the opportunity to go back on some memories from previous parts of it's been one of the real joys of my life to walk the path with Indigenous peoples for much of my career. I learned a lot from it, and it's made me a better Canadian. And any opportunity I have to keep contributing to that relationship, I'm going to take.
Yeah, when we talk about the human dimensions of working in government, and I guess just quickly now that triggers a thought for me. In our work, we talk a lot about the human dimensions of wildlife. Everything's about
Mhm.
relationships. Are there any sort of fun stories or relationships that you have or continue to have with any particular nation or territory or individual that you still hold on to at this stage?
Well, I won't name names, but I tried to develop a reputation of being straightforward with people. That if I couldn't say yes, I would say why and explain it. And I would try to listen and try to find some way of making some progress where we could. This is a time when, resources were extremely limited compared to the kind of money that was being invested these days. So I took some satisfaction that one of the chiefs out west that I won't name, who had a very public reputation for arguing and fighting with the federal government, actually became a relationship that we built, and I ended up being honored in his community and getting an eagle feather, and that was very meaningful to me. So there are people that I've stayed in touch with, even though I left the department 10 years ago. And I think politics is a lot about human relationships. Public service is a lot about relationships. And I look back on some of those relationships that I had with particular leaders who had a big impact. There's a new group, there's a new generation of leaders emerging in communities and advocacy organizations. And I don't always recognize the names I see in the news, but I think it's very encouraging that you see new generations of leaders step up in communities and in political organizations and carry on from their elders and pay it forward.
Yeah, well, let me just say that you giving your time to this conversation today is certainly a huge contribution and contributing to education about co-management. And I know I'll be sharing our conversation with many graduate students to come, and hopefully they can get insights from it. So I'm really grateful and appreciate your time.
Thank you very much. Miigwech.
All right, take care. Thank you for listening to this podcast, everyone. And this episode was the season finale of the Co-Management Common podcast, the first season. And thank you to everyone who was so generous with their time and shared their expertise. I've learned so much through this process, and it turned out to be an amazing form of professional development. I hope others out there that care about co-management also got value out of this, and some new insights should have been gained. Over the course of the season, I tried to make sure there was a diversity of perspectives that got shared with many different people who intersect with co-management in a wide variety of ways. And the topics, as you would have heard, can be very broad. And I've already started to record some new episodes for next season, and I'm really looking forward to sharing those. In the meantime, I will also be revisiting all of the episodes recorded in Season 1 and making as many open educational resources and activities as I can for people who want to learn and teach about Indigenous co-management in Canada. If you would like to contribute to the podcast or share an idea, please get in touch with me. You can visit www.comanagement.ca with a dash after CO. And I'd also like to invite you to join an online co-management community of practice and speaker series that I facilitate. You can find more information about this at www.cloudberry.cc. Professional development in this area shows that you are committed to reconciliation, social justice, leadership, and excellence in the public service. And it would be a real pleasure to meet and interact with you within this space. You'll be very impressed with the dialogues and colleagues that you will meet, and the expert and Indigenous speaker series that happens, and the online community where we're all trying to do better at this work. So I hope to meet you there, and in the meantime, please enjoy the summer of 2024. Have a safe summer season, and I'll be back sharing more episodes of the podcast in the fall. Take care.